Hi again, Dave Esposito, and I'm going to continue from kind of where I left off yesterday, and I was talking about my early forays into artistic expression, and photography was the first, my first real, love when it came to actually making art, and or making photographs, whatever. Um, and I went into it whole hog. I learned, I read, I endless trips to the library, looking at other photographers. I learned the technical end of it, really careful kind of um, exposure and development and printmaking. And I kind of was going by how Ansel Adams did things, if you remember who he was. He wrote a number of technical books on how to expose the negative, how to, and I was doing black and white photography, really. So black and white negatives, how to do them and be able to control the tonal range in the scene by how you develop the negative. And it was complicated, it was like intense. His little book, The Negative, and I mean little, it was about that thick, very fine print, not a lot of photographs, and you could read a sentence and you'd read it again just to make sure you got it. And it was well written, but very condensed information. And then he had a whole series of books, and I went through them all on photography, different aspects of photography, printmaking in particular, which was a big one for me. And I was shooting on, I guess, 35 millimeter cameras, and that was more for like what they would call today street photography. I was very influenced at that age, 22, 23, I guess, by Henri Cartier-Bresson, the street photographer who he had a wonderful book I used to just go over all the time called The Decisive Moment. And he would just capture things and people in very complicated kind of compositions. And they would all rely on everything happening in the film, I mean, in the shot, in a very precise kind of way where everything was at the absolute peak of drama and beauty and just timing. It was back then. He would go around with a little Leica camera and put tape over the front of it, the chrome parts, so people wouldn't notice as much. And he would wait and stalk. And when I say stalk, he would stalk. I guess he might be considered stalking people that he wanted to photograph, but generally he was very quick. He would kind of like wait for something to happen and then take the picture very, very quickly. He didn't use a microphone. I'm sorry, he didn't use a light meter. He basically knew what the exposures would be. He simplified everything in his technique. And unlike Ansel Adams, he didn't do his own printmaking. He had a professional printmaker do his actual printing to his specifications. They were beautiful too. And I remember seeing an exhibit of them from little 35 millimeter negatives at might have been a museum in New York. It might have been Museum of Modern Art. I can't remember now, it's been so long, but they were enormous. The prints were enormous and they were spectacular. And the grain, just to see the grain kind of magnified, and then, seeing these photos from across the room and them being spectacular, and then coming up close and they were still spectacular and beautiful, just amazing design. And so I wanted to emulate that because I was absorbing, other people's work, trying to learn from their work. I wanted to be original, but I knew I was learning by doing what other people who had done before me had done. And the other end of that continuum would have been someone like Ansel Adams, who was walking around or, doing his photography, mainly of landscapes, but he did a lot of commercial work too. But he was known for his beautiful landscapes, Yosemite. Most of you probably know who I'm talking about. Moonlight over, I forget, beautiful, absolutely perfectly timed photograph of a moonrise over Hernandez, I think it was called, in Mexico or New Mexico. And he was another one. He would just be prepared. He would have seen the site, scoped it out, and then he'd get there early and hope for good light. And maybe it would get it and maybe he wouldn't, or maybe he'd get maybe it would become overcast and he wouldn't want to shoot. but he was lugging a huge, generally 8x10 view camera, which are the kind of cameras with a big tripod and a big cloth over the head of the photographer so that he could examine the image on the glass on the back of the camera, the ground glass they call it, which would be upside down and reversed. So it was like really, you know, a fair amount of processing he had to do. And I subsequently purchased a view camera and kind of walked in his shoes for a while. And also the great photographer, Edward Weston, who was really an idol of mine. I thought he had he had a beautiful technique. I mean, even Ansel Adams loved him, you know, was just, I suppose a hero. I don't want to speak for a person who's dead. Ansel Adams passed away years ago now. But Edward Weston was a real poetic kind of photographer. He did all his work basically with a 8x10 view camera too. And he photographed the women he was with, nudes, just beautiful portraits. And then these amazing still life sorts of things. And I promise I will, in a future little episode, I'll flash up some of these photographs that influenced me and photographs of the people that I'm talking about right now, Cartier-Bresson and Ansel Adams. There are many others, wonderful, wonderful photographers. And, you know, back then it was like a photographer, to me, a photograph back then was really special. You know, even the photographs that you would get at the dime store, you waited for them, they came back, you could look through them, you know, you could get reprints, you know, everything took time though. It wasn't like today. And that's one thing about today's, just the ocean of images and the fact that they're digital and they're kind of ephemeral. And yes, they can be printed, but they're not printed in a dark room, you know, and for people like in my, you know, older folks who came up using dark rooms, learning how to do their own developing and processing and printing and mounting, you know, mounting other photographs, matting, all that. I learned all that. Today, it's just a little too, you know, everything's done in the computer. And even though I do spend a lot of time on the computer, too much, but I am aware of that, and I'm trying to back off. I'm trying to like wean myself a little bit, because not that it is a waste of time, but just, it can be, certainly hours, you know, on YouTube looking up one thing after another, you know, and it doesn't even have to be entertaining or stupid. It could be stuff that is important and maybe things you really want to learn about. But then, you know, you wind up either being at the computer and learning lots of new things that you may or may not ever be able to even have the time to apply, or you kind of back off from the computer for a bit and just have some quiet time. I think quiet time is really the thing that I'm moving toward as I continue to get older. So back to photography. So I did a few photography shows, and they were in small venues, a community college where I taught photography and TV. I exhibited there a couple of times, and I also exhibited at some restaurants around town. And I'm trying to remember, not a lot. I didn't do much in the way of exhibiting, but but they were nice. The ones that I did, they were kind of well received. And, you know, one of the restaurants that I put my photos in, the owner was terrific. And, you know, he wound up buying one, and I think I sold him a beautiful, like an 8x10 contact print of an 8x10 negative. I think I sold it for probably, no, I didn't have to sell it. He offered to give me $35 worth of food for, like, you know, coming into his restaurant, bringing my friend or girlfriend or whatever. And that was a lot of money back in the 80s, you know, so that was like 5 meals, you know. And it was a place called Bertha's Mussels in Baltimore, a really famous kind of down and dirty kind of restaurant with lots of the artistic types, you know, in and out, a lot of beer drinking. And, you know, it was neat. It was really cool. And I think the photographs brought the place up a bit too, because at that time I was photographing churches. I was mainly interiors of churches. And I was photographing them all on 8x10 view camera. And so I'd go to these churches. I spent a lot of time just hanging out and just looking and getting to know the priest or whoever was the pastor of the place. And usually they were Catholic churches, but not all. And I wound up photographing usually time exposures, because the churches themselves were so dark and I really didn't want the lights. I was going to try to photograph all with, available light. And I think I did a pretty good job. I mean, I think some of the photographs were really beautiful, to me. I was glad I had done them. Others, not so great, but usually the time it takes to set up an 8x10 view camera and then expose a negative and then take it home and print it, you're not going to bang off 36 shots, like a roll of film. You're going to do a couple of exposures, probably, maybe more, maybe a few more, but, generally I would go out and I'd feel good if I came back with 3 or 4 negatives, three or four exposed film plates. And then I'd have this wonderful time in the darkroom, hoping, and just waiting, just really, really excited about what I think I caught and what would they be, what would the photograph actually turn out to be? Would it be something I could develop, you know what I mean? Not just develop and process, but develop in the printmaking to the mood that I was looking for or hoping for. And I was very careful, so I didn't have a lot of messed up shots. Some were better than others, though. Not like every shot is a masterpiece. But I think my work, what I learned about shooting that way with a large camera, and then even shooting with a small camera, they would all kind of be tied together in one way or another. I wasn't looking for individual, photograph of this, and then a photograph of a landscape, now a photograph of still life. I was like churches. I was doing churches for a long time. And then with my shooting, I was doing not so much people. I did do, photographs, portraits and things like that. And kind of like with some emotional content. But generally, I liked landscape, and I would do, and it's different doing landscape with a smaller camera than a bigger camera. You're a little more free to think of your camera as sort of a sketchbook. And I can't say that I was really looking at my camera as a sketchbook back then, because I really wasn't sketching. I hadn't reached a point where I wanted to really go beyond photography and begin to learn to draw and then to paint. But today I do look at it that way. I look at the camera as sort of, because I work from photographs a fair amount of the time. I look at the camera as not only something that's giving me subject matter to bring back, but also as sort of a sketchbook, or really the fastest kind of sketching I suppose you could do. And so I usually keep, I have a phone with me all the time now. So I used to keep a regular camera with me, a small camera to just grab stuff. So, yeah, so, I guess I feel good about where I got to with photography. And then along about the time I turned mid to later 20s, I didn't decide, I just stopped after a show, after one final show I was involved with, or that I exhibited at the community college I worked at. I just didn't take any more photographs. And I don't know, I couldn't tell. It was like I was saying to myself, well, you're getting good, you could really go further with this. But I kind of felt like it was sort of, yeah, I know I can do that, but I want to try to do something I can't do, or something maybe with more of a challenge, or something maybe just new. I don't know, because the new dangly thing in front of me is kind of something that I'm definitely susceptible to. So that's when I began taking a few exploratory courses of drawing and painting over at the Maryland Institute in Baltimore. And I'll talk more about that. That'll be a little bit more of my autobiography here coming up. It was a wonderful time in my life. It was in my late 20s, I suppose. 28 is when I started. And I'll talk about some of the people and some of the characters and some of my own total misgivings about what kind of success I could ever have in this, since I had real issues when it came to thinking that I could produce anything that looked worthwhile. I was very, very hard. I wasn't, in any way talented or gifted or anything like that. But I'll talk about that more a little later. I'm probably, ready to end this for today. I hope you're all well and staying safe, and, look forward to catching up with you again sometime soon. Okay, thank you.